Generally, high voltage is seriously challenging the applications of GaN. Is that why silicon carbide is more compatible and widely used than gallium nitride in electric vehicles?
Yeah, so the question to that has to do with the silicon carbide and the GaN devices being vertical and lateral. And let me elaborate on that. In order to do high voltage in a lateral device, like the GaN devices, the higher you go in voltage, the larger the separation between the gate and the drain of the device. So the higher the voltage the device, the more they need to be spaced apart laterally. So when you go to very high voltages, then the chip becomes very big because of that spacing. And then you take up a lot of lateral space on the wafer and you get fewer chips per wafer, right? So up to 600 volts, the spacing between the gate to drain is not large enough and you can get a large number of chips from the wafer. Now, once you exceed 650 volts, then that spacing becomes bigger and bigger to get to the high voltage. You take a lot of space laterally on the wafer, you get fewer chips per wafer, and fewer chips per wafer means higher cost. And that's why, with respect to the power devices, all of the companies, and there's quite a few of them, have 600, 650 volts, 700 volt offerings in GaN. Now, there's one company that has a 900 volt, but that's about where things end. 1200 volts in GaN has been demonstrated, but it does take a lot of space across the wafer, so fewer chips per wafer. And also the thickness of the buffer layers we talked about, in order to withstand the 1200 volts, they need to be thicker. And that's also a complication. So the bottom line is today, GaN is competitive at the 650 volt range. And that's very fortunate because electric vehicles are at 400 volt bus. So if you have a 400 volt bus, you need 650 volt devices, which gives you enough overhead. So here's the beauty of things, right? Silicon, very, very competitive at 650 volts. GaN, very strong offerings for many suppliers, very efficient at 650 volts. And silicon carbide is also available and efficient at 650 volts. However, things now are moving to 1200 volts. So they're going to be, instead of having a 400 volt battery, you're going to go to an 800 volt battery, because when you go up in voltage, the efficiency gets better. Now, when you go to 800 volts battery, you need 1200 volt devices. And those do not exist in GaN. And it's actually the sweet spot for silicon carbide, because 1200 volt devices in silicon carbide were introduced in 2011 commercially. So they've gone through many generations of improvement. So if you want to compete with the 800 volts, which is the next generation of electric vehicle, then for GaN, because it's at 650, and it is at 650 because it's limited because of the lateral extent and the thicker buffer layers you need for that high voltage, which are drawbacks, then you need more devices out of GaN than silicon carbide. So therefore, when you get to that 800 volt battery, the silicon carbide becomes more competitive. Now, today, the reason silicon carbide is in the traction inverter in the majority of vehicles that use wide bandgap is because the current levels needed in the traction inverter are very high. And because GaN devices are lateral, they're kind of limited to how far they can go in current. So if you want to use GaN devices, you have to parallel way too many devices, and that creates complications. So with respect to the traction inverter, you have silicon carbide that was released commercially years before gallium nitride. So it's more reliable, more trusted, at least that's the perception. And also it's capable of carrying a lot of current. Now, the traction inverter is not the only thing in an electric vehicle. There's also the onboard charger. Now, the onboard charger does not require high current levels. And really, it's a huge opportunity for GaN because the GaN higher efficiency can make it very small, very, very compact, very efficient, and the current levels that you need are not as high as what you do in the traction inverter, so GaN devices are perfect for that. So I would say that for the traction inverter, the biggest limitation today, where we're at 650 volts, is really the current carrying capability of the GaN device. And then I would say that GaN devices are extremely well suited for the onboard charger of the vehicle. So they're being inserted there. Now, there's also vertical GaN. People are looking at vertical GaN because it allows you to go to higher voltages. But once you go to vertical GaN, you're facing some of the same non-CMOS compatible issues that you have in silicon carbide. So vertical GaN is there. High voltage devices in vertical GaN have been demonstrated, but nothing is commercially available. The thing is, If you look at the lateral GaN, it's got a very high mobility, and very high mobility means low resistance because it has a lateral 2-electron gas that does the conduction. If you go to vertical GaN, you're going to have the conduction of the vertical bulk GaN layer, which is not obviously as good as the electron gas in the lateral. So I think the idea is that vertical GaN, the properties, the critical electric field is a little higher than that of silicon carbide. So therefore you can get a little better performance. The issue, of course, is that you're competing with silicon carbide that has been commercially available since 2011. You're competing with silicon carbide that has basically streamlined the non-CMOS compatible processes and is being made in large volumes today. So it's just a matter of you making the vertical GaN device, if you have enough advantage over silicon carbide to justify economically developing the technology to fabricate. So that remains to be seen, but it's a very tough situation because you're not just competing with silicon, you're competing with, in a way, an established silicon carbide technology at those higher voltage levels. So unless you bring something really good to the table, then you might not be very competitive and justify the cost of the development and production.